Nor is this a new idea. Listen to Martin Luther's words regarding the same issue, which he wrote about the same time he was preparing his own worship service. When we have overthrown the Mass, we shall have overthrown the whole papacy with it. For it is upon the Mass, as upon a rock, that the papacy rests, with its monasteries, its bishoprics, its colleges, its altars, its ministers, and its doctrine. All these will fall when their sacrilegious and abominable Mass has crumbled into the dust. Yet, in order to achieve this aim successfully and safely, it will be necessary to preserve some of the ceremonies of the ancient Mass for the weak-minded who might be scandalized by too sudden a change. We must state in the first place that our intention has never been to abolish divine worship, but to purge the form of all additions which have sullied it. I am speaking of that abominable canon, which is a confluence of slimy lagoons. They have made of the Mass a sacrifice. They have added to it offertories. The Mass is not a sacrifice. It is not the act of a sacrificing high priest. Let us regard it as a sacrament or a testament. Let's call it a blessing or Eucharist or Lord's table or Lord's Supper or the memorial of the Lord, or give it any title we like, provided that it is not sullied by the terms sacrifice or reenactment. Second, recognizing the Holy See's increasingly permissive attitude toward the vernacular, Ellard appears bold when he foresees both a new council, which he anticipates as being a continuation of Vatican I, and a change in the language of the Mass. He writes, "The most sweeping conciliar change in this matter is the recommendation that certain parts of the Mass be given bilingual freedom." Listen to the tone of what he writes. The new missals to be provided are to be bilingual in part, so that, at the celebrant's option, the designated parts may be in the inherited Latin or in a Rome-approved vernacular version. Third, Ellard here deals with streamlining the Mass and proposes new epistle and gospel readings, that the people pray the Our Father with the priest, that the second Confiteor before communion be eliminated, and that the people stand in certain places where kneeling was required formerly. Among other rubrical changes, the ite missa est would be moved so that it would follow the last gospel. Even the ultra-progressivists, it seems, could not imagine that the last gospel would be dropped completely. Ellard's fourth proposal deals with the reorientation of the altar and reconfiguration of the worship space. Shown here is a picture of what would have been considered in 1945 a traditional arrangement of the altar in the apse of the church. Here is the new design, with a freestanding altar arrangement with the choir behind the altar and stalls and seats on the sides. It is in this section where Father Ellard mentions this church, St. Mark's in Burlington, Vermont. Notice that it has what Ellard calls a two-sided altar, so that Mass might be said either, and notice the language he uses, with the priest facing away from the people, while from the other approach he finds himself celebrating in the other manner of facing towards them. He goes on to say that low Mass, especially if it is a dialogue Mass, gains enormously in the proximity and intimacy of the versus populum setting. In this chapter of the book, Ellard quotes two bishops, Archbishop Felton of Bordeaux and Bishop Raymond of Nice, who as early as 1945 publicly favored both the priest facing the people at Mass and the use of the vernacular. And remember, this is 1945, not 1965. Ellard's fifth proposal addresses the music of worship and insists that traditional plain song both be sung by all who are at Mass and that all liturgical music be translated into the vernacular. The sixth proposal brought forward is that of the offertory procession. Ellard provides examples with pictures of where, even in the early 1940s, the offertory procession was in steady use. That it would become a standard practice was not even a question to Ellard as early as 1942. Next, the author deals with what must have seemed at the time a complex matter, deviations in the Mass to accommodate various occupations, ages, classes, etc. Again, almost 20 years before Vatican II, it would seem difficult to imagine that a vernacular Mass with the choice of dozens of Eucharistic prayers was even remotely possible. Ellard then goes on to deal with what he refers to as conventional Masses, meaning Masses being offered when great numbers of people are present, as at a convention. His proposal is, of course, concelebrated Masses, and he concludes by quoting Cardinal Glennon that this is not an innovation, but a restoration. Ellard's last points are, first, that because the Holy Mass benefits the living, it should be offered for the living, not for the dead. And he strongly indicates that the Requiem Mass will be done away with. Second, that the prohibition against evening Masses on a regular basis be removed. Clearly, this provision in the planning of the liturgical movement progressivists made possible the anticipatory Mass on Saturday evening that fulfills the Sunday obligation in every Novus Ordo parish. A mere 14 years after the publication of the Mass of the Future, the Second Vatican Council Fathers would unanimously approve the Constitution on the Sacred Liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium. And in so doing, as impossible as it may have seemed prior to 1960, that approval of the bishops put each and every item that was on the wish list of the liturgical progressivists on the fast track to implementation. As Father Ralph Wilchins so capably illustrates in his book, The Rhine Flows into the Tiber, this unlikely scenario became reality only because of the efforts of highly motivated progressivists whose well-organized and predetermined agenda was foisted upon the rest of the Council Fathers in a deft and well-orchestrated takeover of the Council at its onset. We said earlier that the new Mass was introduced because certain people, convinced that there was a better way of offering Mass, one that would be more beneficial to the Catholic faithful in the pew, gained the ear of the most prominent churchmen of the day. Those certain people who led the way from Ellard's seemingly far-flung proposals of 1948 to their actual fulfillment in 1969 are familiar names: Rahner, Schillebeeckx, Kung, to name but a few. And it is clear that these powerful experts gained the ear of the Council Fathers because the Constitution on the Liturgy, in what turns out to be an irony of history, passed by a vote of 2,159 to 19. And it was passed on the 60th anniversary of Trale Sollicitudini, Pope St. Pius X's motu proprio, the hijacking of which had jump-started the radical liturgical movement at the beginning of the 20th century. The closing of the Second Vatican Council was held on December 8, 1965. In an interview with the editor of Inside the Vatican magazine, one of the members of Archbishop Bognini's concilium stated that the new Mass was completed and on the desk of Pope Paul VI in 1966, only a matter of months after the Council ended. In 1967, the new Mass was presented at the Synod of Bishops in Rome, and when they were asked for their approval, they withheld it. In fact, they rejected the new Mass. Subsequent to that rejection, the Protestant advisors were brought in and asked what, if anything, they found offensive in the new Mass.